decision that we will have organisations like this.
Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. Mr Chair, if the National Party and the ACT Party actually believe the rhetoric that they've been espousing during the debate on this, if they actually believe what they've been saying, they'll be voting in favour of this clause. Because they have argued that if this bill is passed, Voluntary Students' Association membership bill is passed, that all of the services and all of the representation and all of the things that we on this side of the House have argued will be at risk are in fact not at risk and will still continue to be provided, then they'll be quite happy in 5 years' time to have a review and demonstrate all of those things. They'll be quite happy for the Ministry of Education to take the politics out of it, to review and say, yep, this service is still being provided, this service is gone, this is the way institutions are choosing to manage student representation, or student representation may have disappeared altogether. And an independent review, and I think the Ministry of Education would be sufficiently independent, would in fact establish whether the rhetoric being put forward by the National Party and by the ACT Party has been true, or whether in fact it's simply been a move by them to remove from the political process and from the democratic process organisations which have in the past been very vocally opposed to many of the changes that they have tried to make. And I certainly would argue the latter, while they have argued the former. And the reason I would argue that is if we look at the limited experience that we've had in New Zealand of Voluntary Students' Association membership, and it's been limited because overwhelmingly when students have been given the choice whether we have voluntary or a universal system of Students' Association membership, they've opted for the universal system. But in the limited experience that we've had where they have opted for a voluntary membership regime, many of the services previously offered have disappeared. At Waikato University they lost just about everything, so much so that they opted to go back to a compulsory system because the students at that institution valued those services and wanted to see them restored. So I think there's a really good cause to say if we pass this bill today, in 5 years' time, we should reflect on that. Matter of fact, I think that actually that's a broader principle for the House in general, actually, that it would be very useful for us to review many of the laws that we pass 5 years after they have been enacted, to consider whether they are working the way they were intended, or whether, in fact, the House needs to reconsider the matter. I think that's actually probably quite good practice for Parliament to make sure that laws are reviewed regularly, is to determine whether or not they have had the desired effect, or whether they haven't. So I don't think that anybody should be afraid of this amendment, and I think if the National and the ACT Party believe the things that they've been arguing through the debate of this, then they'll be very happy to support this clause. What this clause does is it allows the Minister of Education, the Ministry of Education, to report to the Ministers of Education, that is the Minister of Education and the Minister of Tertiary Education, on terms of reference for a review. That terms of reference would then be agreed by the Minister of Education. The review would assess the impact of the provisions on students and the tertiary sector in accordance with the terms of reference that would be established. So I think and I guess it's important to note that this is 5 years after the date on which it receives the royal assent. So we're not talking about something that would come into effect straight away. It would allow a period of time for the claims that have been made by the people proposing this bill to be tested. And then it would allow students, and a review then would allow students, it would allow the institutions, and it would allow other interested parties to have a say on whether or not the claims made by the National Party and the ACT Party were in fact true, or whether they were misguided as I think they indeed must be. And it would also allow, I guess, the consideration of evidence from international jurisdictions. So there probably is more evidence from Australia of the impact of voluntary student membership than there is in New Zealand, because, like I say, the New Zealand experience has been relatively limited in the universities, simply to Waikato University, which has gone back to a universal system of membership, and Auckland University, who built up a very large asset base under a compulsory membership system, and that has been one of the things that has helped them get through despite having voluntary membership. So it would be interesting in this review, for example, to consider the respective positions that students' associations go into the voluntary system in. Some of the university students' associations in particular have very large asset bases. Canterbury University, Auckland University, large bodies of assets, large cash flows from trading operations that they will go into this voluntary regime with. Others, such as Victoria University, go into it with very few assets, and therefore the impact, Mr Chair, the impact of a voluntary system on them may be significantly greater, because they will lose their revenue very quickly. They don't have trading activities to support them that they can continue to cross-subsidise from. And so a review in 5 years' time would allow those impacts to be assessed. Now, I would argue, in fact, while I am very strongly in favour of this amendment by Grant Robertson, that he probably should have given us a few options, in fact. Rather than a 5-year review, it would have been useful to have some options as to whether it should be after 2 years, after a year, after 2 years, or after 5 years, because I would say that I strongly contend, actually, that for the associations that I've mentioned that have a very low asset base, no trading activities, the impact will be quite immediate. For the associations that have a large asset base and have built up large reserves, the impact potentially is going to be will be felt in the longer term. One of the things that a review after 1 year would do would be to assess how those associations that have built up those large asset bases and large reserves have behaved and what they have put those asset bases, those assets towards. One of the things I'm a little concerned about, it hasn't actually been touched on much in the debate at all, is the potential under a voluntary system for asset stripping of the students' associations once they become voluntary. It is quite possible that when we move from a system where membership of these associations is totally universal to one where a very small number of students could effectively take over a students' association, they could asset strip them, spend the money however they choose to, change the constitutions of those organisations and spend up the money at large, not necessarily for the purposes under which it was originally collected. And this bill doesn't make any provision for that. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's very important that there be some systematic form of review, and I would in fact argue that 5 years is too long to wait to do that. When we're talking about, we're not talking about inconsiderable sums of money. It's in the millions for some of the larger university students' associations. It's in the millions that they have assets and reserves, and there's no protection of those once this bill passes. There's no transitional measures that mandate, for example, any democratic process or any protection of what happens to those assets once these organisations become voluntary. That hasn't been canvassed in the debate by the government member or by the member proposing the bill. And that's something that I am actually genuinely concerned about. That, these are assets that have been built up over a number of years. In the case of my old students' association, Victoria University Students' Association, it's been in existence for about 110 years, 111 years I think maybe. A lot of assets have been built up over that period of time, and a lot of interests have been built up over that period of time that are not immediately tangible assets, but that potentially we need to think about how they'll be transitioned in a voluntary environment. For example, the Student Union building at Victoria University does not belong to the Students' Association because the Students' Association and its benevolence gifted it to the institution, but the association continues to have a significant interest in that. That's based, of course, on the current settings at the moment where all students are members of that association. What happens to that beneficial interest that the Students' Association currently has in that building at the time where it will no longer represent all of the students at the institution, and how will the university, how will the institution manage that? There's no mention of that in this bill, and there's no systematic system or a process set up for addressing those issues in this bill, which is, I think a good justification for there being a fairly thorough and comprehensive review of it. And I would argue that 5 years is too late, but at least after 5 years we would be able to establish where some of the money had gone, if in fact it has disappeared. Because at the moment it's quite possible the money will disappear, we'll never hear anything more of it because there'll be no review to determine where the money has gone. And I am very concerned about the significant asset base that these associations have built up and how that could potentially be abused, and the fact that this bill doesn't make any provision for dealing with that issue whatsoever. So a review after 5 years, as set out in the new Clause 10, which sets out the provisions for review by it's been proposed by my colleague Grant Robertson, as a very prudent and sensible move. And I think that the National Party and the ACT Party would be very well advised to vote in favour of this provision. It's a sensible provision. It's not going to delay the progress of the bill, and it makes sense.
David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I just want to also support the